It almost disappeared. The largest private home ever built in America stood on the edge of erasure less than 30 years after it was completed. Not because of war, not because of fire, not because of a shocking crime, but because it was too big to manage, too beautiful to destroy, and too expensive to be allowed to survive as a home. It sounds impossible. But that was the paradox of Biltmore House. Christmas Eve, December 24th, 1895. Snow blankets the Blue Ridge Mountains. A heavy iron gate opens in silence. A winding road climbs upward toward a structure built not to last a generation, but to last forever. More than 175,000 square feet of floor space, 250 rooms, 35 bedrooms, 65 fireplaces, a single roof spanning over 4 acres. This scale was meant to feel immortal, but that same scale turned the house into a machine that had to be fed every single day. Coal burning without pause, steam circulating through miles of pipes, hundreds of people working in corridors no guest would ever see, and above all, a stream of money that could never be allowed to stop. The moment that money slowed, beauty became a burden, and size became a threat. So who really paid for Biltmore when it was too massive to tear down, but too costly to keep alive? And how high was the price to keep this dream breathing? This is not a story about wealth on display. It is an investigation into cost, into sacrifice, and into the moment an American icon, built to be eternal, nearly vanished from history. If you enjoy deep investigations into architecture, power, and the hidden cost of grand dreams, please like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next. Because to understand why a house designed to last forever proves so fragile, we have to go back in time to the man who decided to build the largest home America had ever seen. Who dreamed this dream? George Washington Vanderbilt to George Washington. Vanderbilt II was born in 1862 into a family that was not merely wealthy, but powerful at the level of national infrastructure. The Vanderbilt fortune did not sit in vaults or isolated properties. It lived in railroads, in shipping lines, in the ability to control how goods and people moved across the United States. By the late 19th century, the Vanderbilt name represented a new kind of wealth built on systems, not spectacle. George was born into that world, a world where money itself was never the question, only how it should be used. But George differed from many heirs of his generation. While other members of the Vanderbilt family built summer cottages in Newport and townhouses in New York to assert social status, George avoided that stage. He disliked parties. He avoided attention. And he appeared rarely in elite social life. Instead, he spent his time with books. From his early 20s, George read European history, philosophy, natural science, agriculture, and especially texts on land and forest management. His personal library would eventually exceed 22,000 volumes. But the significance was not the number. It was the purpose. George was not learning how to spend money. He was learning how to organize space, to organize resources, to organize labor, and to organize time on a long horizon. In the late 1880s, George began extended trips through Europe. He did not travel for leisure. He traveled to observe. He studied large estates that had survived for generations, how they produced their own food, how forests were managed without depletion, how houses, farms, and landscapes functioned as a disciplined whole. What captivated George was not beauty, it was order. From these observations, a central idea began to form. He did not want a house. He wanted a system. At the time, most wealthy Americans built homes for seasonal living or for social display. These mansions could be large, beautiful, and expensive, but when their owners left, they simply closed. George Vanderbilt wanted something different. He wanted a working estate, an estate that actually functioned, not merely a place to live, but a place that operated. Food produced on site, forests managed on long-term plans, labor organized as a system, not just a staff of servants. George did not seek complete self-sufficiency. His goal was to reduce dependence on outside markets and social systems. This way of thinking stood apart from his era. By the early 1890s, the idea was no longer abstract. The dream had taken shape, an estate large enough to operate year-round, enough land to test scientific forestry, enough space to organize agriculture, labor, and logistics as a single organism. And to make this possible, George needed a center, not a farm, not a forest, but a house capable of holding his library, his art collection, and serving as the coordinating core of the entire system. Here, George made a decision that would define everything that followed. He chose to build the largest private home ever constructed in America. This decision did not betray his dream. It emerged directly from it. But from that moment, a quiet contradiction was planted. Because a system designed for efficiency demands flexibility, cost control, and adaptability. While a structure of unprecedented scale requires enormous fixed costs from the very first day, long before the surrounding system can generate any value at all, the contradiction did not explode immediately. There was no crisis, no collapse, but it existed embedded in the blueprint. And once Biltmore began operating, that contradiction would no longer remain theoretical. Construction. Beauty is only the surface. In 1890, when much of the United States still lacked reliable residential electricity, a private structure was designed to operate with an energy footprint comparable to a small town. Not a factory, not a hospital, but the operational center of a private estate. That decision, from the very beginning, defined the fate of Biltmore House. George Vanderbilt did not look for an architect to build a house. He looked for someone who could design scale. His choice was Richard Morris Hunt, a Beaux-Arts-trained architect known for projects that served power and symbolism. Hunt selected a French chateau vocabulary, not for ornament alone, but because it was an architectural language designed to convey permanence, inheritance, and long-term ownership. Materials followed the same logic. Indiana limestone for the exterior walls, durable, weather-resistant, and suitable for precise carving. Copper roofing, expensive up front, but calculated to last for generations without replacement. American oak for structure and interiors, chosen for stability under constant thermal variation. But form was only the outer layer. To realize it, George had to create a temporary industrial ecosystem before any living space could exist. A private rail spur was driven directly to the construction site. Brickworks and woodworking shops were established on the property. At peak construction, more than 1,000 workers labored simultaneously for years. This was not residential construction. It was infrastructure deployment. In parallel, George entrusted the landscape to Frederick Law Olmsted. Olmsted did not design gardens. He restructured land. Decades of logging and exhausted farming had left erosion, depleted soil, and denuded hillsides. Olmsted's design aimed at ecological recovery, so the estate could function over the long term, not simply photograph well. The approach road was lengthened and curved, concealing the structure until the final reveal. Landscape and architecture were conceived not as separate elements, but as a single operating system. Yet the decisive factor at Biltmore was not stone, wood, or scenery. It was technology. The entire structure was electrified. Elevators ran on electric power. Fire detection systems were integrated. Service call bells were installed in principal rooms. Most critical of all was the central steam heating system. Industrial-scale coal-fired boilers were placed in the basement, producing steam circulated through miles of piping to stabilize temperatures across a structure spanning more than 4 acres under one roof. This was hospital and factory technology, not residential. And at this point, Biltmore's true nature became clear. Biltmore was not a house, it was a machine. A machine that required daily fuel, continuous staffing, and could not simply shut down when the owner was absent. Even with no guests, even with no social activity, costs continued to accrue. Here the central contradiction of the story emerged. An estate designed for long-term self-operation had placed at its core a machine with enormous fixed costs from the very first day. The question was no longer how beautiful Biltmore was. The question became how much money a structure like this had to burn every single day just to continue existing. And the answer to that question lay in corridors never meant to be seen by the public. The invisible world that kept Biltmore alive. In 1895, for Biltmore to function through a single day, more than 100 people had to begin working before the owner ever stepped down the grand staircase. They did not pass through the Great Hall. They did not use the main entrance. Biltmore was built with 2 circulatory systems. one for the owner and the guests, one for labor. Behind thick stone walls, a network of service corridors ran parallel to the formal rooms. Narrow, steep staircases, stripped of decoration, connected the basement to the attic above. These passageways had no carpets, no ornamental lighting. They were just wide enough for a single person carrying a tray or pushing a cart. Morning at Biltmore did not begin with sunlight. It began with coal. Before dawn, deep in the basement, the boilers were already running. Every day, tons of coal were shoveled by hand to maintain steam pressure for the central heating system. If that pressure dropped, the temperature in the rooms above changed almost immediately. A small failure in the boiler room could chill an entire structure spanning more than 4 acres under one roof. A short distance away, the laundry operated like an industrial plant. Bed linens, tablecloths, and curtains were washed and replaced constantly. Not for a family, but for a building with 250 rooms. Large steam-powered washing machines ran continuously. Hot water had to be available at all times. If the laundry slowed, the rooms above would lack essentials that same day. There was no margin for delay. On the upper floors, maids, footmen, and house managers moved according to fixed schedules. Breakfast had to appear on time. Fireplaces had to be lit before rooms were used. Service bells connected guest rooms directly to the hidden operations behind the walls. This entire system was recorded in handwritten logs and shift schedules. There was no automation, no buffer. Every position was an expense. Weekly wages, meals for staff, coal for the boilers, maintenance for pipes, pumps, and engines. These costs did not flex, whether guests were present or not, whether there was a party or not, whether the owner was home or not. And here the contrast becomes unmistakable. Above, rooms were designed to appear untouched. Below, a labor machine that could not stop, not even for a single morning. The silence of the library was purchased with the sound of metal striking metal in the basement. The warmth of the drawing rooms was paid for with sweat before sunrise. Upstairs, guests saw Indiana limestone, copper roofs, soaring ceilings, and light. Downstairs, labor was organized through strict discipline to ensure that experience could exist. One side symbolized wealth and stability. The other was a constant, unbroken cost of operation. Wages, fuel, food, and maintenance alone created an enormous fixed annual expense. A system like this could not be scaled down quickly when financial conditions changed. And it was here that a structural weakness began to emerge. Biltmore did not depend on sentiment. It depended on cash flow. When money flowed steadily, the system ran smoothly. But if that flow was restricted, what would happen to a machine designed never to stop? In 1895, that question had no answer. But it would soon appear when forces beyond the estate began to affect its ability to sustain the system that kept it alive. The hidden legacy, scientific forestry. There is something unusual about Biltmore. The part with the most lasting influence is also the part least talked about. It is not found in the great halls, not under copper roofs or Indiana limestone. It exists beyond the walls. By the late 19th century, George Washington Vanderbilt II was not just building a monumental residence. He was controlling more than 125,000 acres of forested land around Asheville, a scale far beyond what most Americans would have considered a private estate. For most landowners of the era, forests were a resource to be exploited quickly. Cut, sell, move on. George chose a different path. He did not acquire forest land to serve as a decorative backdrop for architecture. He saw the forest as part of a long-term operating system. And to make that idea work, he needed a kind of expertise that barely existed in the United States at the time. In 1892, George invited Gifford Pinchot, a young American forester recently trained in Europe, to work at Biltmore. When Pinchot arrived in North Carolina, he was not tasked with beautifying the landscape. He was given control of the forest. Pinchot brought with him a way of thinking that was almost entirely unfamiliar in America. Instead of clear cutting, he introduced selective harvesting. Only trees of a certain age and size were removed. Younger trees were left to regenerate the forest. Woodlands were divided into sections, measured and monitored. Every logging decision had to answer a single question. What would this forest look like 20 years from now? This was not the fastest way to generate revenue, but it was the only way to ensure the forest would still exist in the future. Within a few years, Biltmore became a living laboratory. The forest was no longer treated as a timber warehouse. It became a managed ecosystem. In 1895, Pinchot left Biltmore to pursue a national career in public policy. He would later become the first head of the United States Forest Service. But Biltmore did not abandon the experiment. George continued the forestry program with Pinchot's successor, Carl Schenck, a German-trained forester educated in Europe's rigorous forestry tradition. Under Schenck, Biltmore did more than manage forests. It began training people. In 1898, the Biltmore Forest School was founded, becoming the first forestry school in the United States. Students did not learn in enclosed classrooms. They learned in the forest itself, measuring trees, calculating timber volumes, planning harvest cycles, learning how a forest could be profitable without being destroyed. Over more than a decade, the school trained hundreds of students. Many of them would later hold key positions in state and federal forestry agencies. Modern American forestry did not begin in Washington. It began at Biltmore. This is the part of Biltmore's legacy that rarely appears on postcards. There are no grand rooms, no guided tours through ornate halls, no photographs of spectacle. Yet in terms of long-term influence, it surpassed the house itself. And here a contradiction begins to emerge. Scientific forestry requires time, decades. Its value grows slowly. It does not generate large short-term cash flow. Forests can recover. Ideas can spread. But legacy does not pay the bills. And while Biltmore's influence was spreading across the United States, financial pressure inside the estate was quietly building. But this is where the story turns. Because only a few years later, forces from outside the estate would confront the Vanderbilt family with a question no legacy could avoid. Can a long-term vision, no matter how principled, survive when cash flow begins to disappear? The mathematical turning point. Biltmore did not begin to fail because of a disaster. It began to weaken because of a single line in the Constitution and a surgery that never ended. In 1913, the United States ratified the 16th Amendment, granting the federal government the authority to levy a direct income tax nationwide. Before this moment, families like the Vanderbilts paid little to no federal tax on investment income. That absence of taxation was what allowed vast private systems like Biltmore to operate without interruption. After 1913, the equation changed. A significant portion of income from dividends, bonds, and financial investments no longer flowed directly to Asheville. It was redirected to federal taxes. Cash inflow tightened, while Biltmore's operating costs remained unchanged. Wages for more than 100 employees still had to be paid every week. Coal for the boilers still had to be purchased seasonally. Maintenance could not stop unless the entire system was allowed to deteriorate. Throughout 1913, Biltmore continued to operate, but it was a year of quiet recalculation. Spending was monitored more closely. Expansion plans were put on hold. The margin that once existed began to disappear. The system had not collapsed, but the balance had begun to tilt. Then just 1 year later, the equation lost the only person who fully understood how it worked. On March 6, 1914, George Washington Vanderbilt II died in Washington, D.C. at the age of 51. His death was sudden. He was hospitalized for medical complications and never returned to Biltmore. There was no prolonged transition, no gradual handover of control. The man who had designed every layer of the estate architecture, labor, forestry, and finances was gone within days. For Biltmore, it was a genuine shock, because the system had been built around a single mind that understood it in its entirety. Under the terms of his will, Biltmore passed to Edith Vanderbilt, George's wife. Edith was not an outsider. She was his partner, the manager of household operations, and someone who understood the real cost of keeping the estate alive. But Edith inherited Biltmore not as the guardian of a dream. She inherited it as the person forced to confront reality. George had built Biltmore on long-term vision and the belief that cash flow would always be sufficient. Edith took control under entirely different conditions. The tax structure had changed. The architect of the system was gone, and fixed costs could not simply disappear. From that moment on, the central question was no longer how magnificent Biltmore was. It became, how do you save it when the most expensive elements are also the ones you cannot cut immediately? But this is where the story turns. Because the decisions Edith Vanderbilt was about to make would alter Biltmore's fate permanently. Not through a dramatic collapse, but through cold, deliberate choices, made step by step to keep the dream from disappearing entirely. After 1914, Edith Vanderbilt faced a cold reality. Biltmore did not lack value. It lacked cash. Fixed costs remained: staff wages, fuel, maintenance of stone architecture, and complex mechanical systems. Meanwhile, investment income had been tightened by federal taxation. Edith had few options, but she possessed one asset large enough to buy time: the forest. In the early 20th century, the United States government began seeking large contiguous forest tracts to establish a national forest system. The forests surrounding Biltmore were not only vast, they had already been scientifically managed, with forest roads, inventory records, and recovering ecosystems. In 1916, Edith made a decisive move. She sold approximately 86,700 acres, nearly two-thirds of the original land holdings assembled by George Vanderbilt. That land became the core of Pisgah National Forest. This was not a transaction designed to maximize profit. The sale price did not fully reflect the cost of acquisition, restoration, and years of professional forest management. But it delivered what Biltmore needed most at that moment: liquidity. The proceeds allowed debts to be settled, operations to stabilize, and the core of the estate to be preserved: the house, the central gardens, Biltmore Village. Edith made a decision that ran counter to instinct. Rather than holding everything, she sacrificed the majority to protect what mattered most. It was a managerial choice, not an emotional one, and it worked. In the years that followed, Biltmore became smaller, but it did not collapse. Operations were streamlined. Financial pressure eased temporarily. The house remained standing, but this stability was never permanent, because selling the forest bought time, not a solution. Biltmore was still a structure with high fixed costs dependent on external cash flow, and then another shock approached. Not from Asheville, but from global financial markets. But this is where the story turns. Because 1929 was coming. And this time, there was no forest left large enough to sell. The Great Depression and the 1930 turning point at the end of 1929, an economic collapse swept across the United States. Not with explosions, but with contraction. The stock market plunged, banks closed. Income from investments, dividends, and bonds evaporated almost overnight. For Biltmore, the blow did not come from its architecture. It came from cash flow. The revenues that had once absorbed the estate's massive operating costs began to disappear, and Biltmore could not simply be put on hold. Staff wages still had to be paid each week. The boilers still had to burn coal every day. Mechanical systems could not be abandoned without irreversible deterioration. Unlike in 1916, Edith Vanderbilt had no vast forest left to sell. The land that could be sacrificed had already been sacrificed. This time, there was no reserve asset. Only two options remained: allow the system to slowly drain itself, or break a principle that had existed since the day Biltmore was built: privacy. In early 1930, Edith Vanderbilt made a decision that George had never been forced to confront. In March 1930, Biltmore officially opened its doors to the public, not as a gesture of goodwill, not as promotion, but as a measure of survival. Visitor routes were tightly controlled. Only select portions of the estate were accessible. Private living spaces were completely sealed off. Admission tickets were sold in tiers, priced between $1 and $2. In 1930, that amount equaled roughly $15 to $20 today. During the Great Depression, this was not a trivial expense. Each ticket represented a deliberate financial choice. Ticket revenue did not make Biltmore profitable, but it was enough to pay wages, keep the systems running, prevent the machine from stopping altogether. From that moment on, Biltmore was no longer just a home. It became a space that had to serve in order to survive, a private symbol that stepped into public view in exchange for time. But this is where the story turns, because this model could only survive as long as people kept coming. And if one day the world fell into turmoil again, and visitors disappeared once more, what would happen to a place that had tied its survival to the flow of people from outside? That question had no answer in 1930, but it would soon be asked again as another global crisis cast its shadow across the world. War and a national role. In 1942, the war had expanded far beyond the battlefield. Cities were bombed, ports were blockaded. Europe's great cultural centers burned along with centuries of history. The United States had not yet been attacked on its mainland, but no one believed that Washington was untouchable anymore. For the first time, the question was no longer about victory or defeat. It was this: if the capital were struck, how much of America's memory could be lost overnight? National museums faced a problem with no historical precedent. Works representing history, power, and identity could not remain exposed. The solution was not exhibition, it was quiet evacuation. From 1942 to 1944, the National Gallery of Art secretly transferred part of its most important collection out of Washington. The destination was not widely disclosed. It did not appear on maps. It was absent from press releases. That destination was Biltmore, not because of its beauty, but because of its structure and location. Thick stone walls, enclosed interior spaces, deep inland placement, strict control of access. Rooms once designed for receptions and banquets were converted into temporary storage vaults. Large wooden crates, carefully sealed, were moved in one shipment at a time. Inside were objects that could not be replaced: paintings by Rembrandt, works by Raphael, and one image whose value went far beyond art: the portrait of George Washington, painted by Gilbert Stuart. For 2 years, Biltmore was no longer a destination. It became a national protective vault. Security was intensified. Movement was tightly controlled. Temperature and humidity were monitored daily. There were no visitors, no tickets, no public revenue, only responsibility. A residence once criticized as a symbol of private excess now carried the role of protecting the nation's core heritage. But war does not pay operating costs. When the artworks were gradually removed in 1944, that national role came to an end. The crates disappeared. The special mission ended. There was no justification to keep the estate closed. Meanwhile, the system still required money to survive. Staff still needed wages. Maintenance could no longer be postponed. A massive structure could not live on honor alone. Once again, Biltmore was pushed back to the question it had faced so many times before. There was no war to justify its closure. No national mission to shield it. Only the most practical question remained. After the war, when the special role had ended, when the nation's memory had returned to its museums, what would Biltmore live on? But this is where the story turns, because the answer did not lie in the past, but in how Biltmore would be forced to redefine itself in a completely new America, from heritage to a conservation enterprise. After 1945, the war ended, the artworks left Biltmore, and its special national role came to a close. There was no longer a federal mission, no special protection status, no justification to remain partially closed. But the costs did not disappear with the war. The copper roof still needed repair. The limestone still required conservation. The electrical, plumbing, and central heating systems still had to operate every day for a structure covering more than 4 acres under one roof. Meanwhile, the old operating model had reached its limit. Simple public tours were not enough to sustain long-term survival. Visitor numbers fluctuated by season. Revenue was unpredictable. One major structural repair could destabilize the entire annual budget. This was the first consequence. A heritage site admired by many, but without a financial structure strong enough to sustain itself. By the early 1960s, another reality became unavoidable. Biltmore was no longer merely a private asset. In 1963, it was designated a National Historic Landmark. The recognition carried prestige, but it also imposed a heavier obligation. From that moment on, Biltmore could no longer be sold freely, be closed at will, or altered according to personal preference. It was now protected as part of the nation's historical memory. And here the core contradiction emerged. On one side, preservation duty; on the other, rising operational costs. A title does not pay for roof repairs. Heritage does not pay wages for stone conservators. If the estate continued operating as before, it would not collapse immediately, but it would slowly deteriorate until recovery was no longer possible. And this is where the turning point appeared. Not through emotional expansion, not through uncontrolled exploitation, but through a complete restructuring of how survival itself was defined. Biltmore began to operate as a professional organization. Its functions were clearly separated: conservation, technical operations, visitor services, finance, risk management. Every space was evaluated through numbers. How many people per day could the wooden floors safely bear? How many events per year would preserve the structure rather than damage it? How much revenue was required to sustain long-term conservation? Tourism expanded, but within limits. Events were permitted, but carefully selected. Biltmore did not become a site for consuming heritage. It became a system for reinvesting in heritage. In 1985, a clearly economic decision was made. The Biltmore Winery was established. Not inside the main house, not at the expense of historic spaces, but as an independent, stable revenue source. This was not an aesthetic choice. It was a survival decision. By the late 20th century, the model proved effective. More than 1 million visitors per year came not only to admire, but to pay for the system that allowed preservation to continue. Each year, tens of millions of dollars were reinvested into stone wood roofing, electrical systems, humidity control, and specialized labor. These elements do not appear in promotional images. But without them, everything above would disappear. Only at this point does the conclusion become clear. Biltmore did not survive because it was built beautifully. It survived because it accepted a difficult truth. Preservation is not emotion. It is a profession maintained through discipline and mathematics. But this is where the story turns. Because when a heritage site learns to survive as an enterprise, the final question is no longer, how do we keep it? It becomes, what does it represent in the modern world? The afterlife of a dream. Biltmore is still standing, not because it was once the largest house in America, but because more than once it learned how not to disappear. This story is not about wealth. It is about the cost of power when time moves on. Money can build extraordinary things, but only the ability to adapt decides what is allowed to remain. Biltmore survives today not because of nostalgia, but because of difficult decisions made when there were no beautiful options left. And perhaps that is what it represents in the modern world. Not every dream dies by collapse. Some dreams die because they refuse to change. If you want to keep exploring mansions, families, and empires that once stood in the peak of power but were forced to learn how to serve in order to survive, the videos on your screen will take you much further. If you find these stories worth continuing, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment telling us which place you want to explore next. See you in the next videos.